Well, the church teaches very clearly that the freedom of religion is a human right. It's a right that every human being has to be able to worship God in the manner in which his conscience allows him to. Now, one of the most important expressions of how there can be a conflict with that is what the Holy Father just did this past Sunday, where he canonized a few more saints for the church, and among them was a young boy by the name of José Luis Sánchez del Río. He was a 13-year-old boy who was martyred in the year 1928 during the Mexican Civil War. And that Civil War was, like all of them, was extremely bloody. But what made it unique, it wasn't only a civil war for a constitution, it was a religious war. It was the government literally attacking the church, shutting down masses, closing churches, and executing priests for being priests, executing priests for celebrating Mass, executing bishops for celebrating weddings. It was a very, very dark time in the history of Mexico, and part of that was the people's revolt. People said, we need to be able to worship God according to our conscience. We have a right to be free of that. And so a great mantra came out, or a big scream, as we call it, el grito, is called, everyone was screaming out during the Cristero movement, was Viva Cristo Rey, which means long live Christ the King. Well, that was an affront of saying long live Christ the King, not the government. Long live Christ the King, not any one mob rule. Long live Christ the King, not a feudal system. And that's really what was behind the yell of Viva Cristo Rey. It was a political thing as well as a religious yell of expression of faith. And so we look at that dark, dark history where even Joselito, who was martyred by execution with his parents watching, it was a very horrible, horrible expression of a 13-year-old. That's how much, how fanatic the government became about trying to control people's minds and hearts. Now, we could look at that and say, well, that was 1928 and those things are past. We're more modern and we're more advanced than that. Well, I got news for you. It hasn't gone away. It's a new form of doing that today. Well, we see that in all kinds of the world. There are less countries less free, specifically because they do not allow a freedom of religion to be understood as a human right. And we see this primarily in the Middle East, but also in other places in Asia, like China. They have a very bad record of freedom of religion and human rights abuses that are going on over there. And we could look at those countries and say, well, that's them. But it's also happening here in the United States, where people are more and more saying that religion has no place in the public square. That religion, you can't talk about it because that doesn't belong. That's a superstition. The people of faith are allowed to celebrate their Mass, but they're not really allowed to live what those convictions mean for them. We see this very clearly, for example, in the Supreme Court. In many cases, the most notable one is the Little Sisters of the Poor, where the government is trying to force them to pay for the contraception and abortions of their employees, a thing they cannot do by pure conscience. We see this in Catholic Charities, where we no longer are able to support or be part of the adoption agency because the government tells us we have to give as adoption children to gay couples, which we can't do. They refer, but they themselves can't do it because their conscience doesn't allow that. The government has moved forward and redefined marriage and other instances, and where the issue of religion and government are really coming into a clash. And part of that is going to be the government telling us what religion can teach, what religion can and cannot say. And that's unfortunate because people can't just go to church and not have what they heard affect them. And so every Christian is allowed and must have the right to live their life according to their conscience. And so when we hear about these struggles, we can see that the struggle for freedom of the religion isn't something that happened yesterday, but it's very much alive today. So I invite all Christians that, like Joselito, take your faith seriously and put it out there. And if you have to, scream out, Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King.